Yeah, so there is a storm still as I'm recording this. That's true. All right, so we're getting the same thing that we got last time around. And I played d3 last time. I'm going to stick with that. If knight d4, this time I'm going to take the pawn. Last time we got a position of knight d4. I ended up taking on d4, and my argument was that I'm just going to play like g3, f4, and really try to push for control over the e5 square. Here, I think it's a lot less necessary, so I think I should have taken the pawn. So I would follow suit by taking it next time around. Yeah, the storm has been pretty bad, actually. Undrivable until like today, actually. Today was the first day that where driving wasn't impossible, pretty much. So I'm wondering where I should put my knight here. I'm thinking knight d2. There's a few reasons why. So knight d2, it could go to c4. It could also potentially just stay there for a bit. And if I ever play something like knight h4, I don't know if it'll ever come back. Like, this is interesting. I think knight d2 is a reasonable move. It looks a little awkward just because we're trapping in our c1 bishop, but this is actually totally fine because what we're going to do is eventually we're going to be moving this knight, and this bishop, we don't really have to worry about developing it so soon, just because, well, it does have some strengths where it could actually end up sacrificing itself on h6 here. And that's kind of the problem with putting the bishop on c5. This looks like a normal setup, but if we try going for a King's Indian style attack, then the bishop would rather be closer to the king, maybe, for some defense. I'm looking at h3 here. h3, the idea is to prevent anything from going to g4. If bishop e6 or bishop d7 and queen c8 or queen d7 trying to create a battery, I can just play king h2. So I'm totally fine there. And another thing that I could do is after I play king h2, I could also consider knight g1 now. This is a thing you would see in the King's Indian defense. Positions like this. Sometimes even king h1 instead. And yeah, that's actually a good consideration. Do I play king h1 or king h2? I think I'm going to opt for king h2. It just feels more comfortable for me every single time. I don't know why. It's just like one of those... It just feels good on h2, right? It's just covering the square a little bit more, which is nice. Now, do we go for knight h4? And knight f5 or some sort of f4? The problem is the center is not really locked down, so I'm a bit hesitant to go for any immediate breaks where that could be an issue. Instead, I'm looking at just slower moves like c3 and just seeing what my opponent wants to do. For example, if they go d5, I'm just going to maintain things actually and just go queen e2. If they take on e4, we get these types of King's Indian positions where I'm pretty happy with them. Even though the d-pawns are traded, it doesn't really feel like we have many issues. Yeah, and I think queen e2 is actually just a perfect waiting move here. So I'm going to make that move now. And again, the good thing is, since we played king h2 instead of king h1, we don't have to play a move like knight g1 dropping back to defend h3. If we're going to play the move anyways, might as well make something where we're a little bit happier. And now they just made a mistake. So whenever you play moves like b6 or anything, your first question should be, what am I doing and what am I no longer doing? So what you're doing is you're defending your bishop more and you're covering a5 a little bit stronger, but there's something big that you're no longer doing. You're no longer allowing your bishop to retreat to b6. And because of this, the move b4, where does the bishop go? The bishop is actually trapped after the move b4. So this is a huge problem. And this looks like we are winning a clean piece, which is great. Now after b4, what's the best way they could try to give up the piece? There's only really two that I see. It's either playing knight takes or bishop takes, trying to get 2 pawns for the piece, or taking on f2, trying to argue that there's some sort of kingside weakness. This isn't actually so bad either. The argument here is that if we take on c5, they might take with the d pawn and try to target d3. But I think there is something that will go wrong here, where we can play knight e1 and actually just keep everything defended. So let's take the piece. Of course, if a piece is offered, we should take it. We should calculate, make sure that it's not like a trap or something, but here it wasn't a trap. We trapped them. And now, after d takes, which is the more active option, b takes also makes sense, trying to take towards the center, get more central control, but d takes is a little bit more active. I think both have their drawbacks, and mainly it's just because, well, first off, they did lose a piece here. Yeah, now we can choose 2 different ways of playing. We can go for f4, or we can just try to play things slow. I don't hate playing moves like knight c4, for example. Knight c4, even if they take on c4, it does create like a weird pawn structure for us, but we are up a piece, and we can take some strategic liberties because of that. So that's really enticing me. So one thing we'd have to consider is knight c4 if they take, and then try to play some sort of c6 and d5, trying to open things up. But that does just get rid of our weaknesses, opens up the position, and since we're up material in the first place, it feels like that should benefit us. So I do like knight c4 quite a bit. And if they don't do anything, then my idea is I might remaneuver to e3. And on e3, I'm looking at d5 and f5, and it's just a much better piece. So they end up taking, which I think makes a lot of sense. So if knight a4, they might go queen a4 after. Try to target this pawn a bit. Oh, no, they don't do that. Okay, so this was an option. I was thinking of maybe considering a move like a4, but I have to consider knight b3, just to prevent queen a4, but didn't have to worry as much about that because I was about to say that I had knight d2 as a response. Here, there's a bigger problem. They're actually just losing the h7 pawn, and this is a big pawn to lose. Or h6, not h7. This is a big pawn to lose because after they drop it, well, now all of a sudden their dark squares are weak, and they're creating more weaknesses while already being down a piece. Not even for a pawn anymore, actually, because we just won a pawn. So this feels good. And again, even though our structure looks a little weird, it's doing a great job, and the center is a little closed for them to do anything about it. And if they try to open the center again, one important thing is, whenever that's attempted, they actually just end up trading off any of my weaknesses. And here, they actually end up resigning, which I think is the right call. I always recommend people like play out the games as long as they can. But if the game is no longer fun for you, then of course just like call it quits, right? You don't want to lose your enjoyment of the game. I'm wondering if there's any improvements that can be made here. So knight c3 is recommended. This g3 setup wasn't the top of the list, but of course, since that's what we're going for, I have to say I quite like our position, despite what the computer says. So that's bit interesting to think about. Okay, so bishop e6, c3. Yeah, we could have maybe played c3 a bit sooner here, like in this position, trying to go for an immediate d4, at least considering it, because generally in these types of e4, e5 positions, one of the biggest pros for white is that they get d4 and black has a harder time getting d5 in, which is the corresponding break. And since we're not going for that, and we're opting for, in some cases, less space, yeah, the computer might not be super happy about that. Generally, I'm I'm happy. So, well, it's just because, well, we're playing King's Indian attack, of course. So here, there was an interesting option of playing b4, bishop b6, and a4, trying to go for some more activity on the queen side here. And they'd have to respond with some sort of pawn push. Right now we're threatening a5, trapping their bishop. So let's say a5, b5 in knight e7. And again, we go for this d4 break as soon as we possibly can. And here, looks like white has a slight edge, just because black's pieces are a little unhappy with their coordination here. So that's a very, very interesting variation. And one thing that's really surprising to me is that after takes, it's better to take with the knight, not the pawn. For me, my instinct is always pawn takes, but you have to worry about getting in these d5 moves where all of a sudden, even if e4, they actually can just throw their knight in. And if we ever take, then they should win d4 as a response, even if we can pick up e4. And actually black would have a slight edge here. And this makes total sense, just because if we go down this variation, this looks very uncomfortable in a position like this, where d4 is, this just all feels extremely unpleasant. So yeah, that's a key piece of information to note, is that actually going for b4 and even a4, a5, just to gain some space is a great way to play there. Cool. And I think that covers it. The only other thing to consider is why b6 was played and why it shouldn't have been. So again, b6, it just limits the mobility of the bishop. And generally, when you play e4, e5, if you have a bishop on c4 or not, so if you're playing an Italian or maybe Roy Lopez or something, you should always consider the squares that your bishops or knights outside of a pawn chain, how many squares they have, right? This knight, you don't have to worry. You can see it has tons of squares that are still safe. Like it has 4 squares. So even if it lost like one of them or even 2, it still has 2 more or 3 more. The bishop, how many safe squares does it have right now? Only 1. So that should kind of send some alarm bells to think, okay, what move should I make? And actually a good move here would be a5. And this is top move. And the reason why it's top move isn't just because of the bishop being able to retreat now where it has 2 squares to retreat instead of 1, giving it more mobility and more options. But it also does a great job of limiting white's queenside and expanding with a lot of a grip on the queen side. So that's a key piece of information to note. And that's it.